Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, allegations of media censorship in South Africa. Are journalists being silenced for political gain? We'll unpack this issue. Our digital producer Omar Badar has so much to go through online. Lots of material. What are you seeing?
We do have a lot, and certainly disproportionately people who are critical of the South African Broadcast Corporation, seeing what they're doing essentially as censorship. We have some footage that we just found online here of journalists who are protesting outside of the SABC. Check it out.
No more mind control!
No more mind control!
No more censorship!
No more censorship!
Tell the whole story!
Tell the whole story!
Serve the people!
Serve the people!
Now, wherever you happen to be watching, you can join this conversation right now by tweeting us using the hashtag you see at the bottom of the screen, AJStream.
I'm Shanti Abubaker in Joburg, and I'm in the stream.
South Africa is embroiled in a national debate over media censorship. This after the state-run South African Broadcasting Corporation, or SABC, issued a directive to stop airing video of all violent protests. Last month, demonstrations broke out in the city of Pretoria after the governing party, the African National Congress, overruled the local choice for mayor candidate. SABC did not cover those protests, and many became outraged. The group Right to Know campaign claims the move signalled a return to apartheid times when the SABC was a mouthpiece for the ruling party, an allegation leadership of the broadcaster vehemently denies.
You see, you can't compare 1976 apartheid era and a democratical era. That is a huge mistake that you are committing. And SABC, we are not censoring anything. We will report news as they are.
But several senior SABC journalists have been suspended for disagreeing with the new editorial directive. So here to discuss this issue in Johannesburg, Micah Reddy is a journalist and media freedom organizer with the Right to Know campaign. Reddy Talabi is South African journalist and a radio talk show host. And Jane Duncan is a journalism professor at the University of Johannesburg. Before we start, a spokesperson for Faith Matabi, South Africa's communications minister, said that Matabi would join us on this show. But an hour before our broadcast, he said he was, I'm going to quote here, at the cinema, end of quote, and could no longer confirm the minister's participation. Reddy, I do not know what's going on in South Africa's cinema this week, but it has to be a major blockbuster for the minister to say, look, I'm watching a film, I can't join us. What's going on here?
There couldn't be anything more important than a public broadcaster under siege being questioned and being challenged, and the minister herself being asked to show leadership. So I'm a South African, I love going to the cinema, but I wouldn't choose this moment to do so.
Something else that I found quite disturbing, Micah, was that we had on two suspended SABC journalists. One by one today, they dropped out of the show. They were afraid to be on the programme. Can you explain what may have been going through their heads, and are the suspended SABC journalists, are they being threatened?
Well, certainly a climate of fear is gripping the SABC and has been for a long time. Things have gotten so bad that now people are starting to speak out. But of course, when they do, they face victimization and charges are ongoing. These journalists are suspended. And who knows what has been said to them. We have been communicating with them, but obviously they're a little bit cautious at this time. And in terms, I believe that in terms of their contracts, not in terms of the process, the charges and the suspensions, but in terms of their actual contract, they're not allowed to engage with the media unilaterally without permission from above. This is my understanding. Yeah. And I believe that at least one journalist has been suspended for doing just that.
Right. And just to be clear, they're being suspended either for talking to the media or reporting. Am I right?
Well, it's
yes,
a combination of things. It's a combination of things, because there was a protest outside the SABC, a Right to Know protest, which the journalists insisted on covering. But in the subsequent media interviews, they've told stories of how behind the scenes they've been put under pressure. They have lobbied senior managers to take their side. So I think it is a combination of a lot of things.
Yep. But we are hearing from people online who basically don't think that there is such a thing as absolute press freedom. So we have Abayemo over here, or rather Abayomi, sorry, who says, I don't think absolute freedom of the press exists anywhere. And we have Nurswan over here who says, all media across the world censors, including Al Jazeera English, which censored the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, and many other censored photos of Riva. She was a murder victim, and images of her dying were censored. Jane, but I think that there probably is a distinction here between censoring particular images that might be too disturbing or too distasteful and actually not covering on an entire story. Can you tell us a little bit about that contrast and what's actually happening in South Africa right now?
Yes, absolutely. Obviously, all of us accept that there need to be limitations on media freedom. And those limitations, I think, are fairly well known. Hate speech, propaganda for war, incitement to imminent violence, for instance, are some of the limitations that are recognized even in our own constitution. That is not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is censorship of important information that needs to reach the public. But this is happening in a broader national context. The fact that you have been unable to get journalists who should really be the enablers, if you like, the conduits of freedom of expression in our country is a sign of the state of the nation at the moment. And the state of the nation is really a nation that is closing up, that is becoming increasingly intolerant of dissenting views, a nation that is securitizing, a nation that is seeing intelligence agencies, for instance, getting into political organizations and harassing political activists. We're seeing political activists being assassinated. We're seeing whistleblowers being killed under the most dubious of circumstances.
Jane, this doesn't sound like you're describing current day South Africa. This sounds like you're describing another South Africa that we all knew too well many decades ago.
Well, this is the frightening thing. If we consider the state of the police at the moment, all your viewers will be familiar with what happened in Marikana in 2012, where there was a massacre of mine workers. We thought that massacres had been consigned to the dustbin of apartheid history, but that's not the case. So what we are really seeing, I think, is a South Africa that perhaps many in your international audience aren't particularly familiar with. They will have seen flashes of a worrying South Africa coming through in cases like Marikana, and now more recently with censorship at the SABC. But certainly those of us who are inside the cauldron, if you like, have seen a slow build up of intolerance, and it worries us a great deal.
Yeah. Let me jump in here. Let me jump in here. This matter is actually as simple as it is complex. It is not a case of refusing to show the public sensitive information and gratuitous violence. This is about communities protesting for whatever reason. They are protesting because they are unhappy with the very ruling party's candidates whom they claim have been imposed on them. Some of them are protesting because they don't have basic things like water, electricity, and these are the themes of the upcoming local government elections that are a month away. So think about it. When people take to the streets to protest against the powers that be, they are making a statement against their councillors, they are making a statement against their local government representatives. So why would the SABC not want to show this? What is happening right now is that the SABC has assumed that by showing this violence, it will create more violence. Now, you cannot make such untested extrapolations. These are complex societal matters that require research, and I don't think the SABC has bothered to research that.
But precisely on the point that Femi was making a little bit earlier about comparing it to the past, we have people in our online community who are making that comparison really explicitly. We have Ismail over here who says, it's totally against the hard-fought freedom. This goes back to the dark days of apartheid where news and media narratives was controlled. And then we also have a video comment from Edward making a very similar point. Check it out.
Has always prided itself in having one of the freest and fairest media landscapes in the world post 94. The current trend by the SABC to start censoring what viewers can see is a very worrying trend, and it brings back images of kind of apartheid South Africa, when the apartheid government did exactly the same what the SABC is doing now.
Micah, do you think we're going too far with this comparison, or is it actually a reasonable one to make under the current circumstances?
Look, we're not back in the 1980s, but certainly they're very worrying signs. As Jane said, it wasn't so long ago that the state gunned down mine workers in cold blood for protesting at appalling working conditions. We've seen a growing climate of intolerance, of dissent, of secrecy, And what's happening at the SABC epitomizes so much of this. And I just wanted to add something to what Redi was saying, which is that the decision to suspend 3 journalists for objecting to a directive from above not to cover a right to know protest, a peaceful protest, gives lie to the claim that this is about, that the ban on covering violent protest is about respectability and dealing sensitively with violence. This is outright censorship. There was no violence at our protest. And go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, you've just hit the nail on the head. And you remind me of my experiences when I was a journalist at the SABC. I interviewed then President Thabo Mbeki. And I know for a fact that there were senior board members, including the chairman of the board, who took exception to a 26-year-old, I don't know what my age had to do with it, who interviewed a president. And they asked my boss, ironically, Jimmy Matthews, who's just stepped down, to step in and prevent me from doing such interviews. He protected me, which is why it was quite painful to watch Jimmy become part of the censorship. And I don't know if Jane remembers, actually, we had another experience of censorship. Jane, I don't know if you remember, I was once a co-producer of a documentary on Thabo Mbeki, the most innocuous a documentary that dealt with information that was already on the public domain. What did the SABC do? It self-censored. Now, in that instance, there was no directive from the president to censor the documentary. The SABC, wanting to impress political leadership, just banned that documentary. So what I'm saying is there have been layers and a history and a historical context. It's just that this time around in 2016, we are seeing a brazen and blatant censorship. And this time around, Femi, it isn't just the SABC censoring itself. It is doing so with the support of the ANC, which on Friday was issuing statements condemning the journalists who've stepped down, especially Jimmy Matthews. But then yesterday we woke up to Sunday newspapers of an SABC that is now calling for a probe into censorship at the SABC.
I was a bit confused by that.
It's absurd.
Yeah, I did see that. I was a little bit confused by that. Let me just show you Jimmy Matthews here, his Twitter page. So Jimmy Matthews, until fairly recently, was the CEO of SABC. Here's his Twitter page here. He stepped down. There was a limit to what he felt he could deal with in terms of censorship. So he's digging out his old T-shirts about press freedom here from the apartheid era. Time to get the old T-shirts out. And he's saying here, talk is cheap, free speech isn't. All of us who work in broadcasting, we've worked for state broadcasters, any broadcaster actually, Jane, we know that there are compromises that are made in order to have access to power, access to politicians, sensitive areas that our owners of the networks have. Where do you draw that line?
Well, I think if you are failing to bring matters of tremendous importance to the public in a way that allows them to take informed decisions on the pressing national issues of the day, that is where a line is being drawn inappropriately. Now, the thing about a public broadcaster and what distinguishes it from a state broadcaster is that it needs to have in place a wall of separation between government, its funders, and its editorial content, precisely because it is set up as a state institution.
But that doesn't always happen, Jane. I could name a dozen state broadcasters around the world, probably more than that, where there isn't that line because the funding comes from the government. So I mean, you have to be realistic here and be honest in terms of us as an international community, what our state broadcasters are like.
Sure, but there are certain basic fundamentals that we can put in place in order to at least minimize those kinds of realities that you're alluding to. So, for instance, if you have a board that is selected through a public participation process through Parliament, which is a multi-party process, and is then appointed by the President, then it is less likely that you will have that kind of interference as compared to a state broadcaster where a board is appointed directly by a minister who is ultimately a political appointee. And what we're seeing in relation to the SABC at the moment is an attempt to try and shift the appointment process of the board away from a parliamentary process towards a ministerial process. Other public broadcasters have editors-in-chief, for instance, that make the really tough calls when it comes to editorial decisions. But it is not desirable, as we've got in the SABC situation, for that editor-in-chief to be a senior manager who is appointed by the Minister of Communications. That means that we can draw a direct line between a political appointee, a Minister of Communications, and the editorial content of the SABC. This is not a problem that's peculiar to South Africa, though. We actually, if we compare the transitions in public broadcasting in South Africa to a place like Eastern Europe, for instance, or other countries that attempted to transition following the fall of the Berlin Wall, we actually see quite a few of the problems that they have experienced also reproducing themselves in Southern African.
That's what I was basically alluding to, Jane. Let me just bring.
This is also important, because you've just mentioned that knowing that there are problems in every state broadcaster. But even if we were to judge the SABC through that prism, it still fails dismally. Why am I saying this? It is ignoring its shareholders who are licensed, who are shareholders by paying television license. That's us. And also, the SABC, unlike most state broadcasters, actually gets the majority of its funding not from the government, it gets it from advertisers. If we were to go out and do research amongst advertisers, we don't have that information. So quite frankly, the SABC cannot just say it is there to please the government. There are other shareholders too, and those are the taxpayers. That's you and I, Jane, and every single South African, and of course the advertisers. And at this point, we don't know where they stand on this because the SABC has not bothered to ask them where they stand on this. And just going back to Jimmy Matthews, I'm very impressed that he's bringing out his old T-shirts. And while I support the courage and the fortitude that he has shown, he does need to take some accountability for how he allowed the corporate culture at the SABC and political interference to bully him and change his principles. It's better late than never, but I think that to be fair and objective, we need to acknowledge that he himself has made very detrimental decisions in supporting the powers that be at the SABC and in the ANC for that matter.
You know, Redi, there are a lot of people who see this completely as election tide. We have the Democratic Alliance tweeted saying, the truth is that the SABC under Hladi is simply doing the ANC's bidding during an election where they stand to lose much support. And we also got a video comment from Simon. Check it out.
There's nothing new about censorship at the SABC. It was a major feature of the apartheid regime. And in the last few years, we've seen news broadcasts of the current SABC become more and more influenced by a political agenda. But what's happened recently is extreme, even by the SABC standards, not allowing any coverage of public protest, minimizing negative coverage of the president. It's hard to see this as anything other than cynical electioneering.
Micah, would you go along with that? Electioneering, essentially?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the timing of the ban on covering violence at protest. This comes amid what are said to be the most contested elections in the history of democratic South Africa, and already we've seen upwards of 13 people killed in electoral violence. So I think that's absolutely key. It's very telling that the ban and the purges come at this time. And he's right. Things have suddenly gotten particularly bad. We've seen the most egregious forms of censorship lately. It's worse than anything we've seen before since the broadcaster was transformed in the early 1990s. But I think Jane's point is absolutely critical here. This is an attempt, a very systematic, very concerted attempt by a faction of the ruling elite to capture state institutions, and in this case, to capture the most important media institution in the country. I mean, of the 12, 13 million South African households, TV-owning households, about 7 million of them rely almost exclusively, predominantly on SABC for their news coverage, for broadcast news. So it's an absolutely vital institution. It is the most influential media machine in the country. And what they're doing now is censoring the people's struggle. What happened in Tshwane with the recent protest was, it was huge, but the SABC's cameras turned away. And rightfully, the SABC came under a lot of flack for it.
And also, I think just also, I don't know how these polls work and whether the Democratic Alliance is right to be so emphatic and so sure of its own successes and victory. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that we are in an interesting time in South Africa where for the first time ever, our parliament had been found to have violated the constitution. The very president has been found to have violated the constitution. And right now you have to ask yourselves, as hosts of this program, why are they not here? Why are they not bold enough to be part of
I've been asking myself that all weekend, really.
Conversation.
Yeah.
Why are they running away? We need a plurality of voices. And then they're going to cry that there is biased coverage. And I think that's another way in which they are stifling debate by not making their voices heard at the right platform.
All right. So as they say in South Africa, shame. All right. Guess. I need to play. Has so many meanings. I love that word. All right. I need to play you something. This is the Chief Operating Officer of the SABC. You saw him a little bit at the beginning of the program. Have a listen to this.
People have been saying, Kaiser, we are censoring news. I don't know what is censorship. It's English. Censorship. Who's censoring who? Because there is no censorship at the SABC.
So this is one perspective that we're getting from the CEO of the SABC. And then when we were asking about pushback, what was the pushback that you heard, Omar?
You know, it's quite interesting. We've heard a lot of pushback from people who are bringing race into the conversation. Right. People like SA Patriot, South Africa Patriot over here, who says, while there are challenges to the SABC, today's picket was initiated by white privilege who pushed black faces to the front lines. And we have Support My Dream, who also tweets in saying, I'm not a Lodi fan, but there is a lot of whites using blacks to bring him down. Jane, what do you make of this? Who do you think is dragging race into the conversation, and what's the motivation here? Do you think this is a genuine perception, or do you think it's people pushing that particular narrative?
Well, I think it's a narrative that really has no basis in reality. And in fact, it's an insult to the journalists who've been suspended and the people who participated in the protests in the past couple of weeks. And it impugns their integrity in a way that we really cannot accept. I think perhaps just to go back to the point regarding the elections, I think there's a cycle taking place here that we need to recognize. About 10 years ago, and Reddy knows this particular case well, there was a case involving the former managing director of News and Current Affairs who blacklisted political commentators who were critical of the government. And at that stage, when there was a succession battle taking place in the country within the ruling party, between the then president Thabo Mbeki and the contender Jacob Zuma, there was a power grab on the SABC. Now we're seeing a power grab, an even more serious power grab on the SABC at the moment. And I think it's even more serious because not only are we seeing a looming succession battle that is likely to play itself out in a massive way after the local government elections, but we are seeing declining electoral fortunes on the part of the ANC at the polls. And I think that the broader context in which this is happening is that there's growing political diversity in the country. I think for the first time in post-apartheid South African history, we're seeing an opening up of the political space. We're seeing a genuine contest of political ideas taking place.
Jane, let me just bring in Micah here.
Attempt.
Let me just bring in Micah here. I just want to hear his voice for the very last minute of this programme, which is now what? We have suspended journalists, we have protests outside the SABC in various different cities around South Africa. Now what, Micah?
Well, we've had ongoing protests for the past 2 weeks, and the issue has dominated the headlines, the issue of SABC and censorship and purges and the pushback against all of that. And a group of civil society, unions, activists, journalists now is coalescing, and we had this meeting today, and we will be continuing to apply the pressure and continue. We will be continuing rolling mass action for the foreseeable future until something is done to halt the rot at the SABC.
Wow. This is the end of our show, but definitely not the end of this conversation. It continues at #AJStream. Thank you to Micah Reddy. He's a journalist and also a media freedom organiser from the Right to Know campaign. Reddy Talabi is a journalist and a South African talk show host. And Jane Duncan is a journalism professor at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you guys for being part of this show. Thank you for watching. Until the next time, take care.